Live from New Delhi, you're watching DD India Live, India's voice to the world. I'm Shubhendu Ghosh, coming up in the next 30 minutes. Prime Minister Narendra Modi meets Pope Francis. PM also holds talks with Ukrainian President Zelensky, UK Prime Minister Sunak and French President Macron on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Italy. G7 leaders hail Ukraine deal and commit to faster transition from fossil fuels, affirm action against unfair China business practices. Russian President Vladimir Putin sets out Russian conditions for peace talks with Ukraine, says Moscow will cease fire if Ukraine pulls troops from 4 regions. And South Africa's African National Congress reaches deal with opposition to form unity government. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi participated in the G7 Outreach Summit in Italy's Apulia on Friday. Prime Minister Modi was joined by UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, Pope Francis, among other G7 leaders. Earlier, Prime Minister Modi was greeted by his Italian counterpart, Giorgia Meloni, as PM arrived to attend the 50th G7 summit. India is among the countries invited to the G7 Outreach Summit in Italy. It's 5th in consecutive time India's Prime Minister Modi is taking part in a G7 Outreach Summit, and the 11th time India has been invited to the G7.
G7 is a group of countries with advanced economies. India, with a GDP of $3.94 trillion, boasts of an economy larger than 4 G7 members, Canada, France, Italy and the UK, and is one of the fastest growing economies worldwide. New Delhi emerged as the 5th largest economy, that is even larger than the G7 host nation, Italy. And this highlights its rising global stature. Initially, the focus of G7 used to be on economy, as the leaders of the most powerful economies used to meet. But now things have changed. This is India's 11th and Prime Minister Modi's 5th consecutive participation at the G7 summit. The connection between Prime Minister Modi and G7 started in 2020 when he was invited to the US. But the summit got cancelled due to the pandemic. Later on, he marked his presence at the G7 summit in the years 2021, 2022 and 2023, representing India as a special guest. India plays a crucial role in the Indo-Pacific region. India's strategic partnerships with multiple G7 countries underscores its significance. Its improving relations with Italy, coupled with its long-standing ties with Russia and numerous African nations, positions India as a key player in discussions on economic security, geopolitical stability and development. India's participation in the G7 summit not only underscores its expanding influence, but also its crucial role in fostering global cooperation and sustainable development. As the world navigates through complex challenges, India's leadership is essential in driving positive change. Bureau Report, DD India.
Earlier, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and French President Emmanuel Macron discussed cooperation in several sectors as they met on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Italy. They also reviewed bilateral ties with a focus on Indo-Pacific roadmap. Prime Minister Modi and Macron agreed to expand strategic defense cooperation with an increased focus on Make in India. Taking to social media site X, Prime Minister Modi said, and I quote, "Had an excellent meeting with my friend President Emmanuel Macron. This is the fourth meeting in a year, indicating the priority we accord to strong India-French ties. Our talks covered numerous subjects such as defense, security, tech, AI, blue economy and more. We also discussed how to encourage innovation and research among the youth. I conveyed my best wishes to him on hosting the Paris Olympics, which begins next month." Prime Minister Modi also met his British counterpart Rishi Sunak on the sidelines of the G7. The duo discussed ways to enhance industrial cooperation in the defense sector. Taking to social media site X, Prime Minister Modi said, during the meeting, he reiterated his commitment to further strengthen India-UK comprehensive strategic partnership in the third term of the NDA government. And Prime Minister also held talks with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky on the sidelines of the summit. The two leaders discussed ways to strengthen bilateral relations. They also exchanged views on the situation in Ukraine and upcoming summit on peace being hosted by Switzerland. Taking to social media site X, PM says, and I quote, "India is eager to further cement bilateral ties with Ukraine regarding the ongoing hostilities, reiterated that India believes in a human-centric approach and believes that the way to peace is through dialogue and diplomacy." And DD India correspondent Amritpal Singh joins us live from Italy. Amrit, give us a sense of first how concerns of the Global South found space at the G7 Outreach Summit.
Well, the outreach session is still going on, and the Prime Minister is expected to, raise this very strongly when he addresses the G7 in this outreach session on artificial intelligence and other issues. The G7 leadership is present there, but given the very fact that 12 countries, various five international organizations have been called by the Italian presidency, and these 12 countries are primarily from the Global South, India representing Asia, though Japan is also Asian, but it's already a part of the G7. It's not a partner country. These countries from Latin America, countries from the African continent, countries from the Arab League have been invited. So clearly there is a sizable contingent of the partner countries of the outreach component of the G7 summit. So this issue of the Global South and the concerns and needs, aspirations of the Global South to be factored into the dialogue, into any decision making, into the agreements arrived at this summit speaks volumes of how it's a changed world and is reflective in, as I said, in the invitations extended and the participation one sees here.
Amrit, we understand that engagements on the sidelines become as important as the core meetings. What were the highlights of Prime Minister Modi's bilaterals and one-on-one engagements with world leaders?
You listed out what was discussed with the French president, with the British president, and Volodymyr Zelensky. These were the three that happened before the outreach session. The Prime Minister is currently in the outreach session. After it ends at about 9 p.m. your time, the Indian Standard Time, it will in about half hour. The other bilateral engagements, which are an important component, as you say, of this visit. There's a multilateral component to the visit, which is presently on. There's a bilateral component. He would meet the German Chancellor. He's expected to meet other leaders from the G7. The Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. There are 7 bilateral meetings scheduled to take place before the Prime Minister and planes for Delhi. Issues related to mutual concerns, of course, though these are very short bilaterals, they do not go into much details, but they touch upon the areas that are critical or that are important to both countries. But that does set the direction for the officials to further give impetus to increasing and deepening cooperation on those aspects that the two principals discussed. And of course, apart from that, the regional situation, the global situation, the issues facing the world today are also discussed and in these bilateral meetings. Shivendu.
Amritpal, thank you for those updates. The G7 outreach session on artificial intelligence was also attended by Pope Francis in Borgo Egnazia, Italy. Prime Minister Modi met Pope Francis during the outreach session. Pope said that humans must not lose control of artificial intelligence. He said that technological advancement that makes AI a fascinating tool. However, he cautioned that benefits or harms it will bring will depend on its use. US President Joe Biden and Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni held a bilateral meeting at the G7 summit in Italy on Friday. The G7 leaders discussed immigration, a crucial issue for Meloni, who is pushing Europe to help her curb illegal flows from Africa. Biden and Meloni said they have already agreed on the summit's conclusions, which will be approved by the end of the day. And DT India correspondent Giles Gibson joins us from Bari, Italy. Giles, how are the deliberations at the G7 likely to shape the big conflicts underway in Ukraine and Gaza?
Well, first, when it comes to the war in Ukraine, we have seen some significant developments, especially on the first day of this summit, with the G7 leaders reaching that political agreement to give Kyiv a $50 billion loan that will be sort of backed up or funded by the profits or the interest on more than $300 billion of frozen Russian assets in the West. We also saw the Ukrainian president signing security agreements with both the US and Japan on the sidelines of this summit. So there will be extra cash coming to Ukraine and extra military support coming to the Ukrainian military off the back of this summit. When it comes to the conflict in Gaza, it's a little bit more difficult, I think, to make predictions about that. But we do expect in the final statement at the end of this summit for the G7 leaders to endorse once again that US-led proposal for a ceasefire in Gaza. But really, it looks like in terms of influencing both Hamas as well as the Israeli government to fully sign up to that deal, it's really the US, the Biden administration, that is in pole position there rather than some of these other countries involved in the G7.
And what headway is expected in critical issues of climate change and artificial intelligence?
Well, the focus of day 2 here in southern Italy has been China, but also the afternoon session on artificial intelligence. And we saw Pope Francis being wheeled into the meeting room in his wheelchair, warmly greeting some of the world leaders before he kicked off his speech on artificial intelligence. I thought it was interesting that we saw him shaking hands and warmly greeting the Argentinian president, Javier Milei, who, when he was running to become president of Argentina, was fiercely critical of the Pope. But the two men, the Pope originally, of course, from Buenos Aires, appear to have patched up their differences, and they had a very warm greeting at the start of that meeting. We then saw the Pope launching into his speech a lot of very cautious notes about the potential changes that could come to global society as a result of the development, the very high-speed development of AI. But he did also, in his speech, acknowledge that it could be a force for good in areas such as education.
Giles, thank you for joining us with those inputs. And still to come on this edition of DT India Live. Relief assistance worth $1 million from India reaches Papua New Guinea. Reform UK party overtakes British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's Conservatives in an opinion poll.
We just don't bring you the news as it unfolds. We get to the heart of the matter. We don't just present facts, we demystify complex social, political and economic events.
We break stories that shape the world's present and future because you deserve the truth.
I am Tanvi Taneja from New Delhi.
I'm Ollie Barrett from London.
I'm Nick Harper from Washington, D.C.
Join us on DD India Global Monday to Friday at these times.
Welcome back. You're watching DD India Live. I'm Shubhendu Ghosh. Russia's President Vladimir Putin on Friday set out conditions for starting peace talks with Ukraine. On the eve of a peace conference in Switzerland, to which Russia has not been invited, Putin said Russia would be ready for ceasefire talks if Ukraine withdrew its troops from 4 Ukrainian regions claimed by Moscow and if Ukraine gave up its plans to join the NATO.
The conditions are very simple. Ukrainian troops must be completely withdrawn from the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, and I draw your attention from the entire territory of these regions, within the administrative borders that existed at the time of their entry into Ukraine. As soon as Kiev declares that it is ready for such a decision and begins the actual withdrawal of troops from these regions, as well as officially notifies that they abandon plans to join NATO, an order to cease fire and begin negotiations will immediately follow from our side, literally at the same minute.
Meanwhile, in response, a Ukrainian presidential aide dismissed the peace proposal put forward by President Vladimir Putin, saying it was not a serious attempt to agree on peace and had no relevance to any negotiations. And DD India's Dasha Cherneshova joins us live from Moscow for more. Dasha, there have been references to peace in the past, but how is this peace offer from Russia different?
Well, first of all, it is seen as a peace initiative, not as an ultimatum. That's according to the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov. Most recent comments, Moscow insists that the peace is now possible if Ukraine withdraws its troops from the entire territory of the 4 regions that Moscow now claims as its own. Until now, Moscow has been insisting that any negotiations should be based on the present-day realities. So it does seem that Moscow now says more lens will have to come to Russia if negotiations take place. But also keep in mind that this peace proposal, as Moscow calls it, comes at a time that Moscow has an upper hand on the battlefield. The Russian president said that if Ukraine and the West reject this peace proposal, then the continued bloodshed will lie with the responsibility of those Western countries and Kiev itself. Also, a very interesting moment here is that Moscow says the Ukrainian president is not legitimate source of authority in Ukraine at the moment, as his mandate has expired. So at the same time, Moscow says that it will find with whom to negotiate. Most likely these will be the lawmakers from the Verkhovna Rada, Ukrainian parliament. For Russia, what's important here is not to freeze the conflict, as Putin has said, but instead to find a lasting solution to ensure that Ukrainian non-bloc status, a status of a non-nuclear country, is enshrined in international documents. So all these issues are to be taken into account. But as you have heard before, the Ukrainian authorities and the Western countries have rejected this peace proposal ahead of the peace summit that is due to be held in Switzerland.
That's right, Dasha. And what is the direction in which the conflict is headed, even as the preliminary response from Ukraine is not positive?
Well, at the moment, we understand Moscow insists it will be achieving the goals of what it calls its special military operation in Ukraine by different means. And if the negotiated solution is rolled out by Ukraine, then Moscow will have nothing left but to continue the military activities. A ceasefire is possible only if Ukraine takes the Russian proposal. So the Russian lawmakers from the defense committees of the Russian State Duma have said said that they do not expect any change in the current course. Moscow has already announced that it is increasing its defense spending. Moscow has replaced its Minister of Defense with the economist who is supposed to incorporate the military economy into the overall economy of Russia, meaning that this conflict is expected to be there for a long time.
Dasha, thank you for those updates. NATO defense ministers are meeting in Brussels for the second day. The ministers of NATO member states had gathered on Thursday to discuss their support for Ukraine. Ukraine's defense minister Rustem Umerov in a statement said urgent needs for more supplies of weapons for Ukraine will be discussed at the meeting.
We appreciate for your personal leadership, for the NATO partners for our urgent support, and I look forward to discuss with you long-term cooperation models. And I think it will be our last meeting before the Washington summit, which we look forward to have soon on the leadership level, and we will be, of course, touching all the urgent needs and long-term necessity in the institutional changes that is being proposed.
Moving on, the Reform UK party overtakes British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's Conservatives in an opinion poll ahead of Britain's 4th July election. Reform UK leader Nigel Farage declared that his party was the opposition to the Labour after an opinion poll showed it had overtaken the Conservatives for the first time. The survey, which involved 2,211 participants and was carried out on 12 and 13 June, revealed that Reform UK garnered 19% support, a 2% increase from their previous standing, while the Conservatives remain unchanged at 18%.
What I will do, if you give me the honour of being your Member of Parliament, I will stand up and fight for people. I will stand up and fight for small businesses against the regulators. I will stand up and fight for people to get their rights. I will stand up and fight to make sure that schools are not poisoning the minds of your children.
Cyril Ramaphosa is set to be re-elected as South Africa's president as the country's parliament convened on Friday. The Democratic Alliance said it had signed a deal for a unity government with African National Congress, ANC. The two opposing parties will now come together to usher a new era in South African politics. Two smaller parties, the Inkatha Freedom Party and the right-wing Patriotic Alliance, will also take part in the unity government. A special Indian Air Force flight carrying the mortal remains of the deceased in the tragic fire incident in Kuwait arrived at Palam Technical Airport in national capital Delhi on Friday. The fire incident claimed 49 workers 2 days ago. Several leaders were present at the airport to receive the mortal remains. MOS MEA Kirtivardhan Singh said Indian Embassy is constantly in touch with the injured and are monitoring the situation.
माननीय प्रधानमंत्री के जो कोई डायरेक्शन थे हम लोगों को हमारे एक्सटर्नल अफेयर्स मिनिस्टर के द्वारा हम लोगों को मिला किए और हम लोग उसी के तहत काम किया किए और वहाँ पे जो हमारे एम्बेसी के लोग हैं हमारे आदरणीय एम्बेसडर साहब वो भी बहुत तेज़ी से इसमें लगे रहे और हम लोग सारे वहाँ के मिनिस्टर्स से मिले और उनका हमारे कुवैत की सरकार का बहुत बड़ा कोऑपरेशन इसमें रहा है.
After a devastating landslide in Papua New Guinea's Enga province, relief assistance from India reached the island nation on Friday. $1 million aid was received by PNG's officials, including Foreign Minister Justin Kachenko and Defence Minister Billy Joseph. India's High Commissioner handed over the material to Foreign Minister Kachenko. He thanked his Indian counterpart S. Jaishankar for the timely help. That's all for this edition of DD India Live. Let us know your thoughts on the news of the day. You can connect with us on Facebook, X, formerly known as Twitter, and Instagram. We'll be back with more news as it breaks here on DD India. I'm Shubhendu Ghosh from all of us here in Delhi. Thanks for watching DD India Live. Namaskar.